Hello, everybody, and welcome to tonight's event. My name's Chris Brown, and I'm here on behalf of Pluto Press. As you know, we're all here to launch Peter Fleming's new book, Dark Academia: How Universities Die, which is officially published today, or yesterday, if, like Peter, you're joining us from Australia in the wee hours of the morning. If you haven't already bought a copy of the book, then you can do so, of course, through plutobooks.com, and there is a 30% discount. And you can use the coupon Dark Academia, which is one word, in order to get that 30% off. We'll put details of that in the live chat in just a minute. So we've got a fantastic lineup on the panel today, and I'm going to be handing over to Albena Azmanova, who's going to be chairing today's discussion in just a moment. But before I do that, we've just got a couple of bits of housekeeping that I'm going to go through. So firstly, there is going to be a Q&A. As part of today's discussion. So if you have a question that you want to put to any of the panelists at any point, then please just write it down in the YouTube live chat, and we'll be forwarding that on to the panel. And lastly, if you want to find out about any of our other upcoming live stream events, then please do firstly subscribe to Pluto's YouTube channel. We've got some really great stuff coming up over the next few days as part of Radical May. Now, for those of you who don't know, Radical May it's in its second year now, and it's an international multilingual program of roundtables, talks, debates, and so on, and featuring some of the world's leading radical thinkers. And you can find the full program of those events at radicalmay.com. Okay, I think that's enough from me. So thanks to you all again for joining us this evening. And it's my great pleasure now to hand over to Albena to get us underway. So Albena, over to you.
Thank you. Welcome all. Now I will have to pretend that Peter Fleming is not widely known and even a cult figure in some circles for his writing on the cruel economic and psychological reality of work, and will venture to introduce him. Professionally, Peter's day job is Professor of Organization Studies at the University of Technology, Sydney. He has held positions at Cambridge University, Queen Mary University of London, and Cass Business School, so he's well qualified to tell us about the inside story of how academic production is done. Intellectually, Peter Fleming has been dissecting the world of work, giving us sharp depictions of the wreckage that capitalism has inflicted on our otherwise affluent societies. He has the enviable talent to tell a dark story with wit. His books are truly page-turners. In his The Mythology of Work, which came out in 2015, he observed that work has become a pointless, painful, and inescapable ritual that devours almost every aspect of our lives. His book, The Death of Homo economicus, opens with the following statement: "Welcome to the new dark ages." And it canvases a world in which the professional classes, the people whose lives are commonly envied, are trapped in jobs that are a theater of cruelty, suffering an epidemic of stress and mental illness. In his new book, the one that we're celebrating today, this theater of cruelty is higher education. Peter Fleming lays bare the logics and logistics through which universities are transformed from a place of collegiality and civic purpose, whose vocation is to cultivate and democratize reason, as he beautifully puts it, into a business enterprise, a production plant, an edufactory, his term, where bureaucratic economism, I love that term, bureaucratic economism is destroying not only the capacity for meaningful intellectual work, but often deprives its employees of the very desire for intellectual work, of the courage to resist that hell, and even of the will to live. Now, ironically, this eventually destroys the very entity that universities are meant to produce, knowledge. And this is how universities die, by committing a suicide. Now, we will give you a taste of the book through a discussion between Peter Fleming and two fellow thinkers. Gargi Bhattacharyya is one of the leading scholars on race and capitalism, a dangerous liaison she explores in at least 3 of her books. She's co-author, most recently, of Empire's Endgame. It came out last year. She's professor of sociology at the University of East London. Will Davies is a scholar whose writings span from happiness science, environmental politics to anti-expert politics, with a focus invariably on the power-knowledge nexus. He's professor at Goldsmiths London. He's author, most recently, of This Is Not Normal, The Collapse of Liberal Britain. I am Albena Azmanova. I teach at the University of Kent's department in Brussels, Belgium. I write on judgment and justice. I am the author, most recently, of Capitalism on Edge, which describes the massification of precarity as the great scourge of our time. And Peter's writing both inspires and informs my own research. Now, we have about an hour. We will first hear from Peter, Gargi, and Will, and then take questions from the audience. Now, Peter, tell us about the book.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Albena. That was very kind of you, and thank you everyone for coming tonight to hear about the book. I'm really honoured to have such a wonderful panel to discuss the book. Thank you to Will, Gargi, and for chairing Albena, and also to the folks at Pluto for organising this event. I'll just talk very briefly, introduce some of the themes that I think are salient in dark academia, and what I was trying to achieve with the book, I guess. So universities are dying, but not because of COVID-19. Well, that didn't help, of course. The manuscript was largely, in large parts at least, finished before the pandemic struck. And I was actually quite shocked by how little I had to revise the key themes in the book, whereas other institutions were being rewritten. The connections that I was trying to develop and critically analysing the university hadn't really changed by the COVID-19 pandemic. What we'd seen is some of the cracks and fissures revealed that had been there for some time, and of course amplified. So you know, over the last 30 years, as we all know, universities have been corporatized, commercialized, financialized beyond recognition. And this has been done, these changes have been done in the name of transparency, accountability, you know, taxpayers' value for money, and so forth. But I think now we're seeing some of the very dark undercurrents connected to some of these changes and reforms. And this is kind of what I call dark academia. So what are some of these shifts that's bringing about this phenomenon of dark academia that's affecting our profession? Well, I'll just talk about a few, many of which will be familiar to you. There's been an authoritarian turn, clearly an authoritarian turn in universities, where top-down management hierarchies have replaced academic collegiality, with staff being managed by, you know, KPIs, metrics, various ranking systems, big data, in order to squeeze as much effort out of staff as possible. Universities have been, by and large, transformed into these centers for mass processing of students, kind of like an edu factory, where, you know, more fee-paying students, more revenue for the institution in a business-like fashion. Depression, mental health problems are now rife, not only in the academic community, but also the student body, as sadly the spate of recent suicides has indicated. And universities are now mandated to, you know, almost in a mechanical way, to demonstrate their impact and relevance to big business. You know, what are we doing that's relevant to commercial enterprise? Some of the more troubling developments in this area have been, you know, commercial partnerships with arms manufacturers and the military industrial complex and other various controversial industries. But, you know, critique of the so-called neoliberal university, the corporate university, is not new. It's not new. You know, I can think of few other professions in which its members write about their own industry in such vitriolic terms. Books with titles like The Toxic University, The University in Ruins, The Great Mistake, Academic Capitalism, and I have to say my favorite, written by a retired academic here in Australia, Wackademia, the wacky side of these institutions. So what's new about my book? So what am I trying to add to these very kind of useful sources? Well, there's a couple of things that I've wanted to do. And I think that obviously the global crisis that we've experienced and that our institutions have experienced, particularly in higher education, kind of reflect this. First of all, you know, we know a lot about the objective shifts, the structural shifts in higher education, but I wanted to really tap into those subjective, psychological, emotional elements, how the neoliberalization process is lived on the ground by students, by staff, by academics, and so forth. And I think that there's been a very individualizing process in which many of the injuries, psychosomatic injuries of neoliberalism have been internalized. You know, if we want to talk about privatization, it's not only this formal legalistic term, but it's also this individualization where we take on the injuries ourselves and deal with it ourselves in private, with all of the hidden costs involved there. Second of all, I really wanted to bring students front and center as well. So many accounts at the moment of the fall of the academy, the fall of the professors. You know, students are seen as kind of an add-on, as part of the problem in some ways, you know, that the customers, you know. But I think that we really need to have students really at the center of what's happening here as well, because we were all students. Students are workers now, you know, part of the growing Uberization and the precariat workforce that's at the heart of the neoliberal university. So I wanted to explore the experiences of students as well, and particularly also relating to just the awful burden of debt that's crept into the financialized university, and student debt's a big part of that. I also, thirdly, I guess I wanted to present a critique that's less reliant on this romanticization of the past. I think that's been a problem with critical university studies and critiques of the neoliberal university, that it analyzes the presence and draws a stark picture by kind of building this kind of golden past that, you know, in many cases didn't really exist. You know, the university was never a perfect space. And I think that we can, you know, we had managers before neoliberalization. They were just kind of geared with a different institutional logic, and heads of departments and so forth. So there was never this kind of communal, pure democratic space. So if we need to develop a critique that holds on to what the vision of particularly a public university that I'm quite concerned with, when we wade into discussing higher education today. Fourthly, I really wanted to counter this kind of analysis of higher education that presents academics as victims. You know, the straightforward relationship of domination in which the institutions of higher education were hijacked by career managers, and academics basically fell victim to this process and have to toe the line. They don't like it, etc., etc. And I wanted to show how academic agency was very important in perpetuating the catastrophe that we're seeing today. And I think if we don't do that, then we're not going to be able to develop the tools to fight it as effectively as we should. You know, our, for example, academic labor of love being, you know, very cunningly connected to the market mechanism with the REF, for example, in the UK, career incentives. And in particular, I talk about the lure of academic stardom, which is a classic neoliberal motif that I think has done a lot of harm to our profession and that we should be very, very wary of. And finally, I guess, one of the things that I've tried to do in this book to set the tone of dark academia is to reflect my kind of analysis as a mid-career academic. You know, so many accounts, that some of the most devastating critiques of the university and higher education, unfortunately tend to be done by professional academics who have reached the end of their careers. And they don't really have anything to lose, right? They got their retirement, and you know, I'm not chastising that, but I think that gives a particular tone to the analysis. So what about, we need to write and engage in this debate when we've still got a stake, we've got something to lose in the game. You know, academia is all I know. If I suddenly was asked to do something else, it would be pretty basic. You know, I couldn't do much else. So I think that's an important part of the tone of the book, rather than this kind of reflecting on how awful everything is after the stake is no longer as strong as it was. So anyway, the neoliberal university, whether it's neoliberal or not, is debatable, but you know, I think it's beyond neoliberal now. I think marketization has run its course, and we're seeing something else evolve here. But it's dying, but it's not a sudden death. It's been one that's lingering, and then one that we've been kind of living within and trying to grapple with. So I think that we need to develop a collective response. I think definitely abandon the individualism and the career individualism that's kind of fractured the community. And I guess the book is ultimately trying to argue that we're reaching a critical turning point in the future of the university. And unfortunately, perhaps, you know, the worst is yet to come. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll open it up to, I'll pass it back on to Albena. Thank you.
Gargi,
go straight on. Sorry, I didn't realize I should just go straight on.
Very well.
Sorry, never understand the rules. However many Zoom events I go to, I do apologise. Now, firstly, thank you so much for inviting me to this, which is kind of outside the norm of events I normally do. And I also hugely enjoyed the book, and that kind of, in the way you enjoy picking a scab off your leg, you know, it's a kind of double-edged kind of pleasure, isn't it? And I was very pleased to hear you talk about not being nostalgic, because that was my first point, that I think certainly for myself, and I think really all of us who still work in the academy, that nostalgia is a real enemy of analysis here. That there, certainly in Britain, there never really was a public university, only a kind of version of the aristocratic university. And what we mourn when we kind of look backwards is an institution that was just formed in a slightly different mode of violence, which included non-access for nearly everyone. Till very, very recently, within my lifetime, you know, when I was at school, still a tiny, tiny proportion of British people went to university. And so that's kind of that rapid shift is also alongside, so what we're mourning is that when only 4 to 5% of the population, we think, oh, that's kind of, don't think that's sustainable. And of course, that doesn't mean at all that the contemporary university is not dying. I also think it's dying, and as is the way with big bureaucratic machines, as it dies, is taking down lots of other good stuff on the way. It's not a quiet and dignified death. It's a flailing kind of violent cross-institutional death. I did partly want to say I'm not so keen on dark, because I think dark makes it sound much more exciting than it is. So I've put dark web, dark chocolate, dark and lovely. I don't think that's not my experience of a university. Don't know about where you work, but it's certainly, it's a downward trajectory, and I think everyone who works in the sector pretty much globally that I know echoes versions of what is being said in your book about how the thing that brought them in just doesn't seem available anymore at all. But if we narrate it primarily as decline, again, as Peter's already said, we really risk colluding with some of the most unpleasant of academic practices, a nostalgia for a kind of privilege for a few, an idealization of an idea of the kind of gentleman scholar who used to be able to hang out and drink in the afternoon. Again, I'm old enough that when I first went to work, there were gentlemen scholars who drank for part of the day in the staff bar. My partner was saying, yeah, that was the end of that era. We just saw that. And but that's that kind of heritage industry version of critiquing the university, I think, it brings up tricky things, and it allows us not to see what is really happening and where we could go, because there's not going to be a going back. And even if there was, frankly, I would fight that. If the plan was, okay, what we'll do is we'll chuck out the 80% of the population who now can go in, and we'll whiten it up even more than it is, and we'll olden it up, and we'll privately school it up, I will fight you if that's going to be our project. So that can't be how we frame it. So instead, and I think this is already, it's in every chapter of the book, and I think it's in what's already been said today, the question is much more for us to return to an openness about the question of what universities are for. And this is a sad thing for me to say, but I've been saying it in a few places, that I think that this is probably my age as well, 25, 27, 30 years in, that being in a university is certainly making me more stupid. I'm smarter on entry than I have been after a relatively long career. So I think there's a question, because I don't think that's just my experience, about the place of curiosity, play, risk, unexpected connections, and learning for and with the community. Things which, in its ideal, the university is meant to give you some room for that. It's meant to be a playground for ideas, isn't it? A community of scholars. You say that in Britain, most people burst into tears, frankly. So it's kind of, I can't even joke about it. It's like so close to home, like people are kind of getting choked up. Now, as academic staff, and I think I'm partly invited as a union rep, long-term union rep, I think we're often pushed into defending our contractual entitlements, because our contractual entitlements in Britain certainly are largely being ignored and or attacked. I spend a lot of my time doing that. But as I've already intimated, I think the model of academic life that we're trying to defend might be less desirable than we think, even for us. That small limit of the contract. It might be better than what we have now, but it's still a very poor shadow of what collective scholarship and inquiry could be. And I think the book says some things at the end about, yes, collective struggle, but what can collective struggle win in this time and space? What are our levers of change? What do we fight against? I want us to win collective battles. I devoted a lot of my life to try to do that. But I don't think, for example, winning our pension struggle addresses most or any of the serious issues raised in this book, or most of the industrial disputes that I'm aware of. They're at different speeds, aren't they? There's the kind of defensive position of, this is my contract, this is my entitlement, every incursion must be defended against, which I think is absolutely right, because people need to survive. And then there's the bigger issue of, what are universities really for? And I'm not sure there's anything at present in our industrial relations culture that can shift us into the bigger question. I don't know if that, and if people have got ideas of how we can have that conversation, I'm very interested in it. I think a lot of people in the sector are. So you can see I'm reading on my phone. Okay, I've got a few more things to say, just which are points which come out of the book. Impact. Peter's got a real kind of interesting chapter about how impact is also a kind of hollowing out of knowledge. And of course I understood that, the idea that the impact agenda is used as a kind of anti-intellectual tool to say, well, why do you need to know that? If it's too esoteric, too specialist, where's the impact? As if impact is anything that I can go and say at the bus stop and anyone could hear immediately. That's the only thing that's impactful. But I also kind of wonder, this is a tricky point. I'm going to say it because I've already said the thing about being more stupid, so what else have I got to say? I kind of do wonder if we assume that we're in agreement with each other on that point without examining too closely whether that's really the case. And this is about institutional death more generally and about impact. So one of my theories is that, a bit like the police, universities attract particular types of people. Now, police attract people who like to scrap. Universities kind of attract people who are quite keen to participate in the creation of hierarchies, people who have been smart and are quite keen to deploy their intellectual talents as tools for exclusion or credentialism or outright snobbery. The university relies on us being those kinds of people, enough of us, just like the police rely on enough of the people who come forward being people who like to be in a big gang with a uniform and like to scrap. I thought that might be part of what Peter was nudging towards when he talks about the ways in which there are things about our makeup as academics that makes us not victims, but kind of more complex agents, that are not in a straightforward way, but we are of the thing, and we also are makers of the thing to some extent, or the perpetuators of the thing. So I certainly think going forward, we might need to think a bit more unexpectedly about what it would mean to unmake and remake ourselves. Not least because we're all products of some version of academic horror making, I think. You can't be in the beast without having been made by the beast. So we're all kind of carrying that formation before we even can begin to think about anything better. So that's the difference between, I would like to be a real academic again, please respect my academic credentials and defend my contract. And I do that stuff because it's a good trade union thing to do. And alternatively saying, or alongside that, also saying, but maybe the thing I'm defending being is just indefensible, actually. Need to be something different. And then I think that the something better does have to be in dialogue with others who are seeking to meet our collective needs. And I don't think that's part of the trick of the impact agenda. It's seductive, isn't it? It makes it feel like it's meaningful, that people do it. People, of course, sometimes do it just so their boss will get off their back, but people often do it because it feels like one of the tiny strands in which you can still steal back some agency and control and meaningfulness from your working life. So take away everything else, and impact has been like, but at least, I have a real audience. Look at me making change in the world. And I think, of course, that whatever we remake in terms of collective learning should include the outlandish and the silly and the esoteric and the highly specialist. I also think we need to think about how we persuade our neighbours that all of this has a place in our shared world. I forgot something else I was going to say. Let's tell you all my best stories from old academic times. One of the jobs that I've lost in my time, before I lost it, I had this idea of this really great game of having the Institute of Useless Research, and that we'd have a prize day every year, and people would have to say, here's my completely useless research, and all the others would heckle you and say, that's not useless, you could use it like this. No, you could use it like that. These people care about it. And then the person who can fend them all off, they win the prize. One day I will still run that. a kind of, because it was a silliness that really made my younger colleagues kind of laugh their heads off, because it somehow made sense to them. Anyway, okay, last few things. Stardom. I wanted to say something about stardom because that point really made me laugh. And there's a whole kind of discussion in the book about academic stars and wannabe starlets and what that does to the space of work. And I think, again, it's very hard to work in academia without kind of recognizing that. I also kind of thought, universities are filled with socially awkward and physically unprepossessing people. So I'm dying to say that on screen. I used to tell another joke about that thing about politics being show business for ugly people, that academia is show business for ugly and shy people. And so, good, thank you. One bit of the audience is with me. So that's already, so there's all these people who have never had anyone pay attention to them in their lives. And suddenly, I've written this thing. So I think, oh, that's a bit of a weakness, isn't it? So if you tell that kind of people, the people who never got to ask, asked to dance at the party, or some of you can be stars, it's hard to stop some of them going for it. Because of course we're likely to be more longing for affirmation than even the usual general victim of capitalism. But even though I did think that was true, I do wonder if the star system really operates in the UK, and it'd be good to think a bit about how that globally works. I think the model of the academic star very much looks to the US because of how that transfer market works and how their pay and conditions work. I think the residue of a regulated workplace in Britain, certainly around pay scales, because even though professors are paid off scale, there is still a scale. And so that kind of big transfer market that enables the big star hires in some of the places, I'm not sure it exists here. And I'm interested to see what other people think. I flicked through my head of the most famous people I knew, and I wasn't sure that anyone who worked in Britain really had that star power, despite having the media presence. And so, I think that's interesting. And interesting about, well, what are the regulatory factors that make that less likely in some places? Because that's something you might want to hold on to then. I'm not going to say stuff about debt and international students because I think I'm saying too much and people know that's an unsustainable model. It's very clear that British universities, some British universities are going to be absolutely transformed by the shift and that business model being no longer what it could be. But I had two more things to say. One's about overwork and underproductivity, and Peter's already talked a bit about that. I really thought that idea that the university pushes you to work all hours and yet makes you feel as if nothing you do ever has any meaning really got to something about how the kind of particular sadness of so many colleagues, that really spoke to me. And I hadn't heard someone frame it like that before. I think, oh yeah, that's because unlike some workforces, I do think academics still tend to believe that there is something valuable, urgent, even beautiful about our work. I still believe it, even though, I have to represent members every day who aren't allowed to do it. I kind of think it's hard to give up that belief. Of course, the problem for us is that our employers keep doing their best to prevent us from attending to those tasks, the beautiful, the urgent, the valuable. But I do think that there's something about this promise of sneaking in some real work somewhere works as a disciplining mechanism to keep us in check and playing along. And I was trying, because I was thinking like other groups of workers, they don't really think, oh, they should try and complete their shift of drudgery as well as they possibly can, do what they're told, because then they might be allowed some time to write their book, which I think is very close to how a lot of colleagues function now, that they do all kinds of bullshit tasks because that will buy them or allow them to still do the thing that they think is urgent, valuable, and beautiful. They may never get to actually do that or do it kind of late at night, but it's kind of, that is the payoff, and it works to pacify us or make us, it's certainly one of the things I think that makes us hard to organise as a workforce. And I'm not you know, and I'm not sure I'd even want to, but I don't think it's possible right now to shake ourselves out of being in love with the fantasy of intellectual life. And I was trying to think what that would mean. And I've tried this in certain times. I think I was wrong to say, oh, it's just a job. You know, other workers don't behave like this. Why are you doing that? I think it's just not plausible or feasible with colleagues to say, don't be in love with what you imagine intellectual life can be, or you hope what intellectual life can be, because that's so in the makeup of how we come to this space. You know, it's like saying to people, you know, stop humming a tune in the morning. It's not a dialogue. So my best suggestion, which isn't a very good one, is that we try and redirect that deep desire to some new love object, something which is not called the university. Which brings me to the last point, which is Peter's last bit in the book about hope. Now, I'm not altogether sure that the university merits saving. I think actually that's Peter's conclusion, but he can't quite bring himself to say it, but I'd be interested to hear if that's what he thinks. Is there anything at all in its ruins that we want to keep? Of course, there's all kinds of sedimented resources and histories that reside in it, but the thing, our love object, is hard to find. You know, you want to take the goodies, but do we really want to try and remake the university, or do we just want to let that beast die and call our love of intellectual life and collective learning, and not impact, but ways of thinking about human knowledge that can be translated across audiences into some other way of talking? I did for a while say, never wrote this piece because I was busy trying not to be sacked. I was trying to write this thing called Kill the University to Save the University. But I wonder if even more the point is to kill the university to save the possibility of collective learning. And I'm guessing that's what other people in the room might wish to talk about a bit. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Gargi. One of your statements reminded me of this famous line by Isaac Asimov, that the most exciting phrase to hear in science, the one that heralds new discoveries, is not eureka, but that's funny. So yeah, the fun and the inspiration, the love has drained. You know, you gave us a lot of you poked at the right places for answers. Let us first hear from Will, and then we will go back to Peter. Will,
thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me for the launch of this fabulous book. It is a really kind of brilliant kind of incisive critique of contemporary neoliberalism in universities, and I mean, it's pretty bleak. There's already sort of various reasons to feel bleak about academia at the moment, but it certainly collects them together very successfully, and it's quite enraging to read in lots of ways. I think in an important and potentially empowering way if people take some of its messages and implications on board. So congratulations to Peter for this book, and thanks for having me along. What I wanted to do, and this builds partly on some of what Gargi said already, I wanted to kind of take one aspect of the contemporary university, and I suppose in some ways supplement some of what Gargi said and some of Peter's analysis, and to take one aspect which I think most of us would see as being definitive of universities. It's a feature of universities that has persisted since pre-modern times. So going back hundreds and hundreds of years, it survived through the expansions of the 1960s. It's also survived through the expansions of the 1990s, but which I think at the moment looks unlikely to survive much further and is already deteriorating and in decline. And that feature is the idea that teaching and research have some inextricable link to one another, that there is some reason why teaching should be done by people who are also doing research of some kind, and that research itself, when it's good research and when it's kind of sort of explanatory research about the world, that therefore that should be taken into the classroom and the lecture theatre in some way. Now, of course, there's a kind of nostalgia. We've already talked about the dangers of nostalgia. There is a kind of medieval vision of this figure of the kind of scholar and tutor, and that survives still in the Oxbridge vision of the kind of one-on-one tutorial, and that, no doubt, that model will survive. It's been around for 800 years. No doubt it will survive for another 800 years or something. Now that is not what I'm here to talk about and to defend or investigate. But I think that all of us who work in universities have to recognize that there is an aspect of being both a academic but also of a student which is currently falling apart, which is this relationship of research and teaching to one another. And you already see this in the rise of these teaching only contracts, which are being issued in greater and greater numbers in universities in the United Kingdom anyway, often on quite precarious terms, often not paying salaries over the summer, this sort of thing, and often doing far more teaching than senior academic staff who are on much more secure, much more highly paid contracts further up the university, and have basically entered the university at a time when that vision of the scholar, who is both a teacher and a researcher, was still fairly hegemonic and still fairly kind of untouched by early neoliberal reforms. At the same time, of course, you have this sort of ideal type of the kind of research manager, who is someone who is able to be very good at winning grants from grant-giving bodies, research councils, and so on, but becomes increasingly distant from the kind of both teaching, but also from the kind of life of the university as it's historically been understood. Now, I think there are kind of a couple of ways in which this particular phenomenon that I'm identifying as being a kind of part and parcel of the death of universities in Peter's terms relates to some of the kind of themes in Peter's book. And Peter refers to neoliberalism quite a bit in the book. And I think that if what we think of as neoliberalism is the sort of assertion of the market and other competitive dynamics as being the kind of ultimate arbiters of value, not just in the sphere of material production and exchange, but also outside of the space of the economy, in the space of cultural production, knowledge exchange, and so on. Neoliberalism is a crucial force in this kind of splitting of research and teaching in some crucial ways that I think are kind of lurking in Peter's analysis, and which I want to try and just tease out a little bit. I mean, first of all, if knowledge is to find its value in the marketplace rather than in the sphere of deliberation, critique, peer review, for all the ways in which we all have our sort of problems with peer review and all of its kind of injustices and failings, but nevertheless, it is something that is a buffer to the market in certain ways. But if the market becomes treated as the sort of ultimate arbiter of value in relation to knowledge, then of course the way in which research is valued and the way in which teaching are valued become to look extremely kind of different, not necessarily entirely incommensurable, because of course there's still a kind of ideal of the price system that is hovering over both of them. But the idea of how knowledge as in research gets valued by the market is ultimately as R&D, as a form of input into a kind of an investment into productive activities, the discovery of ideas and products and creative outputs and so on that will have some kind of future market value for the economy. Meanwhile, once teaching becomes viewed through the lens of the market under a neoliberal rubric, then, as we know, teaching becomes seen as something very, very different, which is that it is a sort of a transaction. It is a kind of service that is provided to a customer, a student, who is judging that service through some sort of satisfaction metric, things like the National Student Survey and so on. But also, and this is ultimately what authorises things like the tuition fee regime in countries such as the United Kingdom, that at the same time, tuition is an investment in human capital that will pay some kind of future return further down the line. This generates two really quite different ideas of what an academic is fundamentally. On the one hand, there is this kind of idea of the research project manager, who is someone who kind of manages a budget, a grant, often does very little research themselves eventually, because they become primarily trusted with the handling of budgets, the hiring of research assistants and various research fellows, again, who are seen as kind of good value for money from a research council's point of view, because they might be earning a third of what a professor earns, but they will be also on a fixed term contract, and the research manager becomes someone who basically kind of oversees this sort of a basket of various resources. Meanwhile, on the other hand, teaching becomes increasingly like a form of coaching, really. It's a way of sort of transmitting various sets of abilities, skills, capacities for employment, employability, and so on, such that the classroom becomes less about someone who is sharing knowledge that they themselves have some kind of stake in, some kind of made some kind of lifelong commitment to, and instead becomes a way of transmitting particular kinds of behavioral, cognitive, sort of characterful capacities, such that someone can then go forward with the persona of a graduate towards the labour market, and ideally earn some kind of graduate premium that allows them to start to pay off their debt. And those two different roles may increasingly have very little to do with each other. And I think we already see that in some of the kind of hiring practices that have been developing in universities over the last 10 years, particularly since the financial crisis, and particularly since the rise in the UK of the current fee regime of the £9,000 a year plus fees. I want to say just a couple further things about that. And Peter's book, he talked about the context of the pandemic, and he mentioned how the book had begun before the pandemic struck, but of course universities are now facing a kind of different future again, and some of the forces of neoliberalism and commercialization that Peter talks about in the book have clearly become deepened. Clearly there are various people in higher education and in higher education policy-making bodies who see this as a kind of useful crisis, a kind of, who subscribe to a kind of shock doctrine mentality, which is that this is going to unleash a kind of creative destruction amongst universities that will have certain kinds of positive payoffs in terms of the kinds of reforms that have been desired by various parties within higher education and within politics over the last 20, 30 years. And I think the key development, I think this is really no secret, is the broader kind of platformization of higher education and teaching. Peter talked about the Uberization, and I guess these terms are sort of pointing to similar phenomena. There's been a kind of, the last decade, there has been a sort of creeping of the edtech industry and platformization across higher education. Beginning, I think 2011 was a kind of boom year, and the sudden surge of the vision of MOOCs, the massive open online courses, initially kind of unveiled by Stanford and MIT around about 2010, 2011. And this kind of created this ideology that in the future there will only be sort of 20 universities in the entire world, and each of them will have hundreds of thousands or millions of students enrolled in these universities. That has been through various kind of peaks and troughs and cycles of investment and booms and busts over the last decade. But over that time, it's gradually sort of developed some kind of momentum, also in schools, incidentally, but that's a separate issue for the time being. But accompanying that vision of EdTech and that vision of the massive open online course, which is often, nowadays we've done all of our teaching over the last year on Zoom and these platforms like Panopto and this kind of stuff. But it's not just about trying to get different technologies into universities and get people to start becoming better equipped at making videos and that kind of thing. It brings with it an entirely different pedagogical philosophy. For any of you who've done any of this teaching and done any of this learning will know that this is not simply about lifting what has gone on in lecture theatres and seminar rooms, as flawed and as that may be, and simply putting it into these kind of digital forums. It is about actually a different pedagogical philosophy. And that pedagogical philosophy, which has been referred to by various critical education scholars as learnification, Biester and others have talked about this as being a kind of new ideology emerging in the 1990s via the policy advocacy work of bodies such as the OECD, but also some of the kind of gurus of the knowledge economy that effectively started to challenge the what was perceived to be the monopoly of universities and other educational institutions over the sphere of learning, and start to bring in new providers, as they're known, and start to treat the transmission of information and knowledge from those in possession of it towards those who are the learners, instead of treating that as a social relationship, as a relationship of dialogue, a relationship through which the world becomes understood, through which identities can become formed, necessarily a political relationship in certain ways, and one which opens people up to the world in new ways that they couldn't have expected before they entered into that relationship. Instead, this kind of vision of learnification is one in which the learner kind of gradually over time, through various forms of digital interaction across an interface, acquires these sorts of cognitive and behavioral habits and capabilities that can be constantly tested as they are transmitted. That as soon as a piece of information is transmitted from the provider to the learner, immediately there can be some kind of feedback path in the form of a quiz or an evaluation or some kind of questionnaire that is constantly being filled in over the journey of the learning process. And within this kind of ideology, universities, first of all, they are deliberately challenged and they are deliberately treated as holding a kind of illegitimate sort of cartel over the sort of broader industry of learning. But secondly, the role that they can play, if they are to survive at all in this kind of platform-based sort of global learning industry, the role that they can aspire to is to become kind of partners with the edtech industry. They become they have to kind of open themselves up to partnership with commercial providers. They have to see themselves increasingly as competitive commercial providers in this kind of global market for the provision of learning services in various ways. And if, going back to that kind of 2011 vision of the MOOCs that Stanford and MIT kind of unveiled, where there was this idea that, in the future there'll only be sort of, a handful of universities in the entire world, I think that kind of future was always a utopia. It was a utopia that was partly delivered, was designed in order to try to sort of, unleash more venture capital into the edtech industry and that kind of thing. But if there is at least that kind of sense of creative destruction in the air again at the moment, and I think there is, because of what's been kind of discovered through what the edtech industry sees as this kind of miraculous experiment that we've all been involved in over the last sort of 15 months or so. Survives, they're going to do what it takes in order to be the kind of winners from that process of creative destruction and not be the losers. And that means beginning to increasingly refashion themselves as this sort of partners to edtech commercial providers, but increasingly see themselves as organizations that need to somehow kind of bypass traditional vocations of teaching, traditional pedagogies, in order to access some of that global market. And there's a fairly kind of frightening PwC report that I read a month or two ago, which was based on a survey of the chief financial officers of various UK universities, or maybe they managed to do all of the UK universities. And they were talking about what are the positives that have come out of the pandemic. And from this survey, it was clear that the chief financial officers of these British universities saw the pandemic as having lots of positives. One was they believed that academics were much more attentive to the financial dimensions of the university and the bottom line and the costs that universities incur, and recognizing that they have all of this space around them that they're not using, and maybe it could be put to other purposes, and maybe it does not need it at all, and all these sorts of things that these chief financial officers saw as being kind of things that they've been arguing for 10 or 20 years, and finally the academics are kind of waking up. This is what this survey says, but also that they believe that academics were now finally getting on board with kind of online teaching and learning and this sort of thing, and that finally the kind of radical efficiencies and the radical kind of sort of customer focus that platformization could unleash was finally coming into view. So this is seen unambiguously as a positive thing. It's also, the education experts from the OECD also celebrating the pandemic in similar ways. So I suppose just to finish, the task is not to simply kind of reach back for the kind of medieval vision of this sort of gentleman scholar that Gargi was kind of criticizing earlier. It's not even necessarily to reach back for some particular kind of 1980s or 1990s vision of a kind of professorial contract, and necessarily to suddenly just sort of reach for the privileges that used to exist and no longer do. But I think this central question, which I want to kind of add to the discussion, which is that if universities don't think that research and teaching have anything to do with each other at all, then what is a university under those conditions? Why would you even have those two different functions and those two different activities going on in the same place? And do academics still want to be academics if those two things become kind of unlocked from each other? And do students still want to study in universities if they are being taught by people who do not see themselves as having any aspiration to think and to write and to read and to learn themselves? And on what basis is research being undertaken if it's no longer seen as having some kind of commitment to students, to younger people, to older people, but to society at large via the medium of teaching, and where teaching ceases to be seen as a kind of a vocation at all? So I want to kind of leave things there.
Thank you, Will. Now, Peter, would you like to respond to some of those things briefly so that we also take questions from the audience? Peter,
Fantastic.
over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Gargi and Will. Very, very relevant and interesting insights into the book and some of the themes you've teased out there. I would agree with everything you've said. Gargi, you're right. Just looking at some of the points you made regarding this way in which there seems to have been a bifurcation between in the academic profession between, you know, this academic labor of love, you know, that drives us, unlike many other professions that we read in the weekend. You know, I've been guilty of finding myself on a beach in the summer reading, you know, God knows what, some turgid text, and enjoying it and thinking this is great. You'd get very few professions that see that type of behavior. And to the point where you get, you know, you hear academics saying a lot, you know, I hate my job, but I love my work. You know, the job being the stuff that we have to do within the edu factory and all of the administrivia that we've been given and so forth. But when my work comes to it, well, that's kind of separate, you know, that's separate. That's something that is really part of me. And I think that's been a driver of many careers, and I think it's been quite successfully co-opted by the institutional mechanisms that we now find so harrowing and difficult to deal with as a profession, which makes resistance an interesting activity, given that we have to resist some of the things that are very, very close to us as well. So I think that's a very, very good point. And just the other point that Will mentioned as well regarding nostalgia and romanticizing the past year, that's something I've really been trying hard to do, to emphasize that point very strongly in the book, that this kind of pining back to this romanticized past is very problematic. And historically, the university has a very kind of tumultuous history, a very problematic history linked to colonialism, for example, in one period of the university's development, and so forth, the gentlemanly scholar and so forth. So we definitely have to be very careful about that. And just one of the final points you made, Gargi, around, you know, do we want to save the university? So this is a big theme in the book, you know, is hope permissible? And I think one of the problems is that you know, what will come next, it's not really in our hands, and that's part of the problem, right? So we're not the authors of the university. So the key workers of the institution are no longer the authors of its future. And we can talk about this a lot and about what we would like to see in the problems, but ultimately, you know, the detachment of a managerial elite has rendered these discussions academic, to put it in those terms. And I think that's part of the problem. So I think we need to go even one step back regarding that division between the key workers, the knowledge workers inside the institution, and those who have authorship over the destiny and the future of the institution. I think that's a major part of the problem. And Will, thank you so much for your comments as well. I'll just pick up on a few of the themes that you mentioned very briefly. The bleakness of the book, it is pretty bleak, you're right. And I guess one of the things I was trying to do in the book was to counter this very kind of optimistic strain that had emerged a few years ago within the community, the slow professor and so forth, that, there is hope. And I was thinking, well, okay, there might be a modicum of hope, but, I'm desperately searching for it. So I wanted to counter that, to give, to not in a fatalistic and a nihilistic way, but to kind of send the message that things are pretty bleak, and that you have to be very, very optimistic in this situation to see hope. But also one of the trickier parts of doing that in my research for the book is that perhaps even bleaker than my view were the neoliberal critics of the university as it presently stands. One of the things I wanted to convey in the book, that the arch critics of the university today aren't necessarily only on the left. And, especially in the United States situation, yeah, they were embracing some of the rabid market orientated analysts of higher education, coming out of that James Buchanan tradition of economic theory, absolutely embraced the pandemic. It was an opportunity to reset the clock, shake down the market, boil it down to its basic essence, and to reconfigure these large institutions around a more supple, streamlined market mechanism. So one of the things I wanted to try and do in the critique of the university was to show how we needed to bypass and to be very careful about not feeding into that very neoclassical economic view of the university. So the critics are not only on the left, in other words. And regarding the division between teaching and research, yeah, you're absolutely right. It could be a symptom of the massification of the university, in terms of it becoming this kind of more, which then opens a lot of questions about how we understand the future of the university in terms of, what is it for in terms of students and so forth. But I think your vision of learnification, geez, I think that's pretty bleak as well. The PwC report, that's really kind of, if that is the future of the university in terms of, ed tech, then it does raise some very, very serious questions. And I think you're right, that we really need to kind of reconsider how we think about teaching, which has been farmed out, if you like. A lot of teaching has been farmed out to this precariat that's at the center of the university. 60–70% of the workforce in many universities consists of this precariat that does all of that work while researchers do their research and so forth. So it's a very, very interesting point there. But I won't go on anymore. I think Albena, shall we open it up?
Yes, thank you. Actually, I want to emphasize a positive side, to this bleakness that was highlighted here. Peter, you offer, what's very importantly, you offer a very lucid, organized, thorough diagnosis. And if there is any healing to happen, we need this kind of precise diagnosis. For instance, when you describe the logic that is driving all this as bureaucratic economism, actually you suggest that this new model has taken the worst sides of the bureaucratic welfare state and the neoliberal market logic. So these are we need to confront both of these things, for instance, because if we label it as one neoliberal enterprise, we only pay attention to the market logic. So I think what the prospective readers should see in this book is a very helpful, very clear diagnosis of the problem. And this is where our struggle starts with. We are equipped with that diagnosis. So I want to turn now to some questions we received from the audience. We start with a brilliant question, warming my heart. Tom Holdenby is there anything us in the student body can do to help build resistance to the degradation of higher education? Any ways we can use our limited influence as customers in these institutions? So would you have an idea of how we can build a block together with our students, or how they can help?
Should I address that question, Albena?
Yes,
or should
it's also addressed, I imagine, to all of us. So start if you have some.
Well, I can just make a quick point, and then maybe Will and Gargi, if you would like to add to it. I think that this division between, you know, the faculty and students has been very, very, very problematic, and has obviously been a divide and rule strategy. You know, student evaluations and so forth, and that we need to see some common struggles between academics and students, rather than being opposed struggles. And I think the customization of, or commercialization of, the student experience, to use the parlance that is very popular in universities, has been part of that. So building that solidarity would be very, very important. I think it's also important to note that, not to be nostalgic for the past, of course, but this very hierarchical authoritarian relationship between teacher and learner. You know, learner reminds me of a awful lab experiment. Learner is very new. Is very new. That it used to be, in some contexts at least, and I'm thinking of, you know, radical pedagogy here, a shared experience, and that it was a more of a less hierarchical authoritarian relationship. And I think we would do well to revisit some of those key ideas regarding emancipatory pedagogy. So that would be how I would see that. But yes, definitely more solidarity on that front.
Gargi, Will, would you like?
I just wanted to say briefly, I mean, I think, you know, in amidst this, the bleakness that I referred to, I mean, it's worth also, one of the reasons why a lot of us feel down about these topics is that universities have got a long history of being largely uncommodified spaces, with, like, there's uncommodified physical space that is available. There is uncommodified time historically of events and exchanges and discussions that don't simply happen because of some kind of potential market value. And these things have used to dominate universities, and they are increasingly now shrinking. But that doesn't mean that they disappeared. I mean, they are still there. A lot of them, these spaces are still there. If universities were, if these chief finance officers that I was talking about earlier had their way, a lot of that space and a lot of that time would just get completely kind of annihilated. And yet they don't completely win the entire time. And that time and that space, there are a lot of things going on in universities that don't make complete financial sense. In fact, a lot of them don't make any financial sense at all. And a lot of those things have value in different ways. And you know, you just think about students, I suppose what I'm getting towards is that students can play a crucial role in maintaining the kind of weaving together the activities of teaching with the rest of the life of the university, because they move between lectures, seminars, events, extracurricular events that they don't have to attend in any kind of obvious sense, but they can also organize events themselves. They have the events of the student union. Students stand on picket lines with academic members of staff. So students in some ways are sort of like a bit like this sort of water that kind of flows around universities, going in places wherever they're able to go, and knitting the whole thing together in certain ways. Now, one of the kind of tragedies of the last year, 18 months, has been a lot of that kind of liquidity that kind of connects different bits of the university, you know, students sitting in on bits of degrees that they find interesting but aren't actually part of their curriculum. All of that kind of stuff has tended to kind of disappear for the last year or 18 months. And that really is, again, is the danger of platformization, is this idea that you only engage with the university for the specific purposes that you have kind of paid your fees for, and to get the specific return on that investment that you can then take to the labor market. Students don't want that from universities. Most students do not want that kind of university experience, to use the kind of motif of contemporary university management. Most universities want universities to be more than that. And I think that the more students continue to kind of uphold the kind of vision of university as not simply kind of disaggregated experiences and products and investments, the harder it is for those kinds of chief finance officers to enforce their will upon it and to treat the university purely as a kind of bundle of assets and services.
Right. So more in-person teaching, scrap student evaluations, more parties.
I'm not student evaluations. I haven't even said that they're the problem. I mean, I think it's right that we are held to account in certain respects.
And I agree.
There are very bad teachers out there. I'm not suggesting all is rosy. I'm saying that by being there at all and by turning up and participating, students are keeping something alive that universities themselves are not very good at keeping alive.
Right. Gargi, any ideas? That's a very important question.
Well, as already said, of course, certainly I know Britain, I know the sector in Britain, and that there's been, in the last number of years, very vibrant and very important solidarity between students and staff, not least because academic staff have been in a series of industrial disputes. Now, many students are in different kinds of disputes with universities, including rent strikes, you know, kind of resurgence of extreme radicalism amongst the student movement. I'm slightly worried about that because of who can be involved in that kind of student activism. And it's in the book as well, but not only the pressure on students, but the financial toll on students, especially low-income students, has meant that that kind of free space of the university is taken up by working 45 hours a week for whichever crappy employer in your town will employ you. That pushes students who, not through their own desire to narrow their education, but just through the physical constraints of how many hours you can be awake, to instrumentalize their learning. And I think you can really see in the sector this huge division between universities that really serve much poorer communities where everybody works more than full time, and universities where you have a mixture, I'd say Goldsmiths is like that, and then universities where you're basically still serving the rich, and that the student ambience kind of alters around those things, because you know you can't be in solidarity easily with anyone if you have to do a night shift and then wake up in the morning to come to classes, and then you know it's kind of tricky. So I think there's something about the whole precaritization of work and the pushing of the risks of higher education funding onto students that it limits it, doesn't it? Doesn't mean it's not possible. And I certainly think students of all kinds that I've ever met want something different. They you know, I've never met someone who comes to be sold a very narrow set of commodified contacts with someone who can't learn your name, and you know that's not what people are signing up for, even the most time poor people. But I think there's something about, you know, how do we think of what staff-student solidarity means in this moment of additional time pressure and income pressure, so that it doesn't work otherwise without that. I think the student rent strikes are kind of a huge entry point. I think some of the other kinds of anti-gentrification projects that have been going on across staff and student groups are a real entry point. I think we should perhaps start saying to each other more that we should come together explicitly around an agenda of reclaim the university, even though I said we should kill it. But
okay.
So that extends further.
Yeah. Let's continue thinking about that. I'll move on to the next question. Now, there is the following question: do you support the views of critics such as Frank Furedi, Stefan Collini, and the think tank Policy Exchange? Too many students, too many degrees, too much poor academic work. Peter, any thoughts about that? Do you think that indeed there is a superfluous academic activity?
Look, I think we need to be very careful about that particular critique, that the problem is massification of student numbers less people should be going to university, how that is articulated, and it can get articulated in a number of ways. The one that I'm very worried about is the Theresa May / Boris Johnson version of that particular argument, where, you know, defending student fees and increasing student fees by arguing that some people just should not be going to university and should become mechanics instead or enter a trade. And this kind of, you know, harking again, this kind of right-wing nostalgia, if you like, this right-wing nostalgia of
Right.
what the university ought to be. So I think we need to be very careful about how we approach that question, that there are too many students in the university. Superfluous academic work, again, it makes me uneasy to kind of get on board with that, I'd have to say.
Will and Gargi, do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't agree, as you can imagine. I don't think there's any more. I could say some rude
Okay.
things, but people can see it in my face.
Good.
I mean, I think that some of this is a pushback against what happened over the 1990s, particularly in the UK around the time of the Blair government, where there was a lot more money flowing into higher education. It was universities later which were quite keen on the fee regime because it gave them some kind of control over their own budgets. So there was a kind of a gravy train for universities over the course of from the sort of early 90s through the financial crisis. Universities have still not really faced their kind of austerity moment in countries such as the UK, because the new fee regime allowed them to carry on basically, you know, bringing in students and carrying on to covering the sort of high salaries of some of the senior management, and also to, you know, keeping on some people who are not, you know, there are certain kinds of investments that universities have carried on making, which depended on very large student numbers, and you know, particularly overseas students who were seen in fairly kind of nakedly financial terms in order to fund various kind of expansion programs and that kind of stuff. So some of these critiques are a pushback against what is has been an industry that has been growing and growing and growing without really yet hitting any kind of hitting the buffers at all. And I think there's a sense that he's basically some of these kind of right-wing culture warriors, and this is, I think, maybe going to be the next question, but places like Policy Exchange and so on have kind of spotted an opportunity to say, right, you've had your kind of, you know, moment of you've had your sort of the good times are kind of over, and now you've got to kind of face the music that the rest of the economy and the rest of the public sectors face. So there's a certain sort of I suppose partly a kind of resentment there. I certainly don't think that we can argue against more students going to university. That's not to say that there aren't kind of, you know, universities that are not giving students what they should be having in various ways. And it's not to say that every single research project, every single journal article that universities produce is very, very good. I mean, of course, there are sort of patchiness, but I think that, you know, we have to kind of recognise that some of these critiques are made against a particular kind of financial backdrop, which also included a kind of politics that again dates back to the Blair government, which wanted to make higher education a kind of solution to society's ills. You know, that higher education, along with other forms of education investment, could somehow kind of generate this sort of perfect classless society in which social mobility and meritocracy kind of ameliorated all other forms of social ills and class dynamics. And that was not a realistic vision either. There was a kind of, you know, too many kind of political hopes were heaped onto universities, that if only universities could become kind of more dynamic and enterprising and so on, then suddenly we could have this kind of perfect kind of society where people earned the correct rewards for their own sort of, you know, innate talents of some kind. That was the kind of neoliberal golden age view of the 1990s. And I think, you know, none of that stuff was entirely realistic. And some of the kind of critiques now are simply the sort of realization that universities were never going to be the answer to all of society's ills in that way.
Thank you. Let me move on to another great question. What about the more recent war on woke and the impact it is having on universities? Peter? Any thoughts, or anyone? The war on woke, the pushback, you know, the claiming of universities as safe spaces.
I've started with each of the questions, so would someone else, like Gargi, would you like to take this one?
Yeah, not really, but I hear what people are saying. I think people in the room understand how just kind of bad faith this kind of war on woke is. I can't believe really that it's gone so far. It's such a transparently concocted culture war. It feels like people read, you know, the last 2 iterations of culture war and thought, oh, what can we say now? Now everyone's on the internet. And it's very hard for me to judge how deeply it's felt in the wider population, because I think previous culture wars in Britain were at moments when public media was consumed very differently, when the power of the press was somewhat differently constituted. So, I mean, I know that the Daily Mail is still writing about it, but it's very hard for me to judge whether it, you know, that Thatcher's kind of attack on the so-called loony left and on LGBTQ organising, that really worked. In the 80s, there's a kind of narrow band of public culture which was very much affiliated with the dominant party in the state and the government, and it took up a lot of the public space. I find it much harder to read how much of this is landing or where it's landing. On an optimistic day, I feel like it's just playing to the Tory party gallery and no one else. But I think probably both of you have got a better sense of it than me. I just think we've lost that sense of one register of public conversation, so it's much harder to see how things are falling out around it. But it's just, you know, it's bad faith baiting. Whether or not it's working, I think, is a different question.
There was on that question, I mean, there was this YouGov survey published, I think yesterday or the day before, about this question. I mean, I'm saying, you know, I'm sure that YouGov methods are not the kind of perfect answer on this, but they asked the general population, do you think woke is a good or bad thing, or do you have no idea what it is? The vast majority of people didn't know what the term meant. Only 15% of people said, I know what woke is and it's bad. Now, so that shows that actually this kind of relentless messaging of the Telegraph, the Times, the Mail, the Spectator, actually doesn't, you know, I mean, of course, the readership of those newspapers is also now quite slim relative to the whole population. It happens to be a certain section of the population that is quite electorally significant because they tend to be a bit older, they vote heavily, they are people that the Conservative Party sort of traditionally sort of seeks to represent. But it's not, you know, it doesn't have this huge kind of cut through. So it's based on a vision that has been cooked up by, of course, a lot of it's imported from American culture wars, but in the UK, it's primarily the Murdoch press, the Barclay Brothers press, the Spectator and the Telegraph, and it's become a kind of a cause célèbre that basically works in tandem now with the Conservative Party, and clearly is being pushed by Oliver Dowden and the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. We've had the free speech kind of legislation that was introduced with the Queen's speech last week. And it is basically a sort of, I mean, you know, it's not too much of an exaggeration to say that it's a conspiracy theory, because it is a theory that these particular disciplines, such as critical race studies, have basically taken over the university and have started to shape thinking about questions of gender and identity and history and nationhood and all these sorts of things, well beyond the scope of these particular fields of critical theory and cultural studies and this sort of thing, as if these, what are basically, we all know, relatively niche in the broader scheme of things, spheres of critical theory and humanities disciplines are the kind of dominant strand of thinking in universities. Now, the way in which that comes together with neoliberalism is that the humanities disciplines, which are already kind of struggling in various ways, and that, you know, applications for a lot of history degrees and so on are falling. There are history departments being closed down in various places. There was one, I think, recently being closed closed down in Aston University and so on. But the government is ganging up on them by saying that they are low value degrees, which or dead end degrees, as the Education Secretary referred to them earlier this week. And there is the argument that in addition to them having no kind of market value, they also fill, the youth's heads with all this stuff about, that the sort of empire was kind of a bad thing and this kind of stuff. And I think that these sort of things kind of are coming together with a kind of financial rationality of neoliberalism with this kind of cultural rationality, which also comes together with a kind of electoral rationality of the Conservative Party, which is that fundamentally people with degrees are voting Conservative in smaller and smaller numbers. The Conservative Party has become the party for people largely without degrees. That is mainly on generational issues because, anyone in their 60s, only about 10-15% of people in their 60s have a degree. But by and large, as people go to university, they become less likely to vote Conservative for various reasons that we could speculate on. And I think this is a genuine threat to the Conservative Party in the long run. I think that's part of it.
Well, thank you. I will just read some of the remarks that we received from the audience. First, as we are discussing the death of culture at universities, it should be noted that the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro is facing material death as funds run out. So if things are bleak in the affluent West, let's not forget what's happening, the horror happening in the rest. So another remark by Alberto Duman, looking at the argument of fees reduction, cuts for students due to the pandemic, academic staff has not been very vocal in support of those demands, which shows very little alliance with students. So there is really a deficiency of support to students by staff. And then finally, by Sue Moron Garcia, given what has been intimated about overqualified graduates, isn't part of the problem the equation, this equating of higher education with getting a specific job? I think we exactly addressed that point, that the stress on preparing students to be commodified. Our job as commodified intellectuals is to prepare students for the labor market, and this is one of the drivers of this nightmare we've been discussing. So our time is almost up. I want to thank you all for helping this book to release it in the world, help it walk. I'm sure that we will have many more discussions on this topic. Well, until next time. Peter, congratulations for this important creation.
Thanks, Albena, and thank you everyone for coming tonight. I really appreciate it, and I hope you enjoy the book. And special thanks to the panel, Will and Gargi. Wonderful conversation and some very complex issues here. And I really appreciate helping launch the book tonight. Thank you.